I will start, to share
Perfect.
it also on Facebook. So please.
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. I am really honored and delighted to be here today to share some of my work and hopefully inspire you to really help prepare yourselves for the reconstruction of Ukraine. And it's, I think urban design is a fantastic field. So I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully you'll feel that this is a really great way for you to get involved as well. So let me share my screen. And go full screen. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see my slides. And, the first thing I want to do is I just want to ask each of you, think about your hometown. What made it unique? How did it evolve?
Робить його унікальним. Як воно розвивалося в контексті своєї географії, культурного контексту, економічного, історичного.
Now I want you to actually close your eyes and think about your favorite part of your favorite street in your hometown. What is it that really makes that your favorite part? It might be that it's just some particular memory that delighted you, but it might also be the space, the design of that street. Is it a feeling of enclosure, a sense of the street almost feeling like an outdoor room that is at the heart of the community, lined with local shops? Is it the nightlife? Is it bustling cafes? Is that what you really kind of remember? Or is it more that integration of the city and nature, trees that arch overhead and create a canopy and dappled light? Is it the grandeur and the history of the buildings, or even the vernacular, unique buildings that really connect you to your community? Or for you, is it more about the people? Is it that what you love about that great part of that great street is that it's such a good place for people watching and a diversity of different kinds of people? So with that image, hopefully in your head, why aren't the other streets in your city quite as nice, quite as successful, really places that you want to go? Do they have more cars than people? I know that's true where I live. The streets I love tend to be filled with people, and the streets I really dislike have too many cars, too much asphalt, too many blank walls at the ground floor. They're just plain boring to walk along. So, okay, with that said, open your eyes. Now, I want to tell you already, I think you're starting to think like an urban designer. So now I've got sort of two images, again, somewhat contrasted, similar to what the little exercise of contrasting different kinds of urbanism. And the point of this is I want you to try to start to see the world like an urban designer. So I want you to sort of look at these two images and read them. What's different? Part of becoming an urban designer is what I love about it is you actually learn how to read the landscape around you, read the cities. We all know how to read, so it's easy enough to just suddenly you start to learn. You have to learn how to see what the city in order to read it. What's the language that it's talking in? So both of these are public housing projects. The one on the left is a Soviet-era public housing project in Kyiv from the 1950s. Pretty common building types, the large, tall apartment buildings, or it could be the Khrushchevkas. On the right is also a public housing project, but a much more recent one built in Stockholm, but also built by the local city planning department. But I would argue that they are speaking different languages. Each of these are prioritizing different things. The Soviet housing was absolutely prioritizing mass housing economically constructed after a crisis, the need to just build a lot of housing affordably. And the emphasis is on these blocks, the buildings themselves. They don't actually face the street. In fact, they put blank walls up to the street. There is landscaping in between them, and probably that is, I'm sure, used and beloved by the residents. But the landscape sort of just seems left over. The focus is on the blocks of buildings. The solid object buildings is really what that urbanism is about. On the right, the Sankt Erik project in Stockholm, I would argue, is almost the opposite. The landscape now becomes figural, that oval garden that the housing encircles. The axis between the street that's up at the very top of the slide down to the river gives you a sequence of spaces, public spaces, of the landscape garden sort of in the middle, then a little bit of a more formal garden, then the steps down to the garden and the pool at the river's edge. It's the buildings to some degree are background to the landscape, the public space. And yet those buildings, they're not entirely just background. They have a strong character, these shapes, the symmetries, the geometries. But it's one would argue this is also economical housing, but it's now being designed with a reference to the past, the red roofs that are traditional in Stockholm, the materials, the scale is much more human, the size of windows, the shapes of things. So I would argue that the Stockholm example is providing residents with more choices of how to live, because we see it's not just stacked flats. There are townhouses, there are smaller buildings, there are taller buildings. There's a mix of different kinds of apartments and flats and different kinds of outdoor spaces. So there's some difference in, one could say that the Soviet era was absolutely championing equality by making everything, people don't have choices, but people all have the same. There's an expression of equality, whereas the other one is more about providing choices. So which of these should inform the rebuilding of Ukraine? I don't know. That's up to you. That's up to Ukrainians to decide. But I think, I can only tell you what I think about urban design and what kinds of a future people want. But this is very much, it's up to you and the Ukrainians to figure out really what are the values and what is the type of architecture. So, but I will tell you what I think makes for good urban design. And it depends on the context in which.
Є прикладом.
Urban design guides how a city grows to become healthy, to become just, have good systems of justice, and to be resilient and sustainable. Now, good urban design integrates many, many factors, and I'll get into more detail on this, into those designs. But what is organizing all of it is the framework of the public space. The attention to the shared spaces, the parks, the streets, the plazas, the civic buildings. Those are really what give identity to a building, to a city, and those are the spaces where we build our larger communal bonds. Private space is important, but private space kind of takes care of itself. Urban design is focused on how do we organize the public space so that the private space reinforces it? I think good urban designers often ask, what if kinds of questions? What if we redesign this park as both the neighborhood's shared living room and to provide flood protection from climate change. That was the condition of the lower example, the 2 slides that I'm showing there. In the diagram, in red, it shows what used to be a shopping mall that had been built on top of a creek, but the creek kept flooding. And so finally, and it was devastating, the whole area around it. So finally, the shopping mall died. They completely demolished the mall, replaced the mall and its parking lots with a park, but it's a stormwater park. So the park is designed a little like a bathtub. In good weather, it's a green space for the community, and they daylit the creek. But then when there are storms, it fills with all of the stormwater and protects the rest of the community from flooding. It's a really terrific example in Meriden, Connecticut. Another example, what if question is just, what if we reallocate some space in our streets away from cars to give more space for bicycles, for wheelchairs, for sidewalk cafes, as shown in the upper picture. So these kinds of questions, questioning, do we just rebuild exactly as things were, or do we rebuild in ways that make a space better and help the larger community? So now I'm going to shift to describing in a little more detail what it is that urban designers do. So I want to introduce you to the pictures, at least, of 3 of my students. They've actually just graduated, but Jenny Lynn, Hala, and Harini. So they were one team working together in the urban design studio class that I teach at Georgia Tech in Atlanta. And we had several teams all working on sort of sometimes on the same site, sometimes on different sites. But collaboration in teams is extremely important to urban design. No one discipline designs the city. So what was the first thing we did was we went out and we met with and we met with community members. In particular, we had some elected officials with us. We had, we actually got our local bus took us around because we had the commissioner. He was able to tell the bus to take us around, but we listened to the community. They wanted to have their community they had a lot of aging and at this point dying and sometimes really falling apart suburban shopping malls and strip malls and older commercial retail areas. And they wanted them to be more walkable. They wanted to be able to access more affordable housing. They wanted more connection to nature. So even though in this case, we were retrofitting suburbia, which is what most of my research focuses on, it's in some ways, it has some similarities to rebuilding a city that's been hurt by war. So the next step is to really analyze the site and the context. And we did a lot of analysis. So in this particular, Jenny Lynn, Harini, and Hala were working on redesigns for the North DeKalb shopping mall, which had recently died. And as you can see in the upper photo, it's a big building surrounded by even more just endless parking lots. And it just was, what do you do with this very large site? You can see the city of Atlanta in the background, but extremely car-oriented. So we looked at I'll show a couple of slides of the kinds of analysis that the urban design team did. So they said that the site, so the mall is this little piece in here. And so an easy walk is that circle. And then a 10-minute, sort of 15, 20-minute walk is this larger circle. And they were looking at what are the assets of the site. There's a park, there's a creek, with a bit of a trail. but that really there weren't very much access to amenities in this area. So they analyzed the housing options in particular. There's within walking distance, almost all of it is single family homes, which tend to be very expensive. There are a few apartments over here out on the edge, but not really not much affordable housing and not much housing for households that want a smaller household. In fact, we found that there was a big mismatch because most of the population is actually 1 or 2 person households. And so these big single family homes are sort of not really what that population needs or wants. It leads to a lot of excess energy use. And we found that people were driving on average 30 to 40 miles a day because they're living in these detached homes and they don't have very many amenities around them. So we're seeing problems. We looked at climate change, saw that by 2080, this area was going to get a lot hotter in summer, colder in winter, and with much more diverse sort of severe weather. We looked at solar energy potential. We looked at energy use intensity because we had urban designers working. Hala is actually a performance building student. And so she was focused that much more on sort of the water and energy usage and climate. Stormwater, we looked a lot at. The site sits right on a creek that does have that flood, it floods, and you can see the floodplain. So it had been built up on a sort of artificially high land. And this is showing that the students studied the sections to understand, but all of that parking is what that meant that every time it rained, the stormwater is picking up the metals and toxins that have fallen from the cars and dumping it from the parking lots into the creek and contaminating and polluting the creek. So reducing the parking became obviously a goal. So considering all of these problems, and then once the students have really started to figure out solutions, the most important thing they're coming up with is this design framework of the public spaces, integrating those multiple solutions. So in their case, Jenny Lin and Harini and Hala focused a lot on the landscape. Jenny Lin is actually a landscape architect. Harini is an architect and now becoming urban design. Urban design pulls together people from many disciplines. And Hala, also with an architecture background, but becoming that much more of an urban scientist, pulling these things together. So they looked a lot at the water drainage and recognized that there was a creek that on the other side of the street up here that had been put into a pipe under the shopping mall. And they said, wow, if we could daylight that and clean it, we could get a wonderful water-focused park and use the natural landscape to clean the water coming off the building roofs and the streets before it gets to the creek. They also decided to keep 2 of the buildings of the old mall and re-inhabit them because there's so much embodied carbon footprint. This is really important for climate change. We don't just want to tear everything down. If you can save a building, if it makes sense, there's a lot of carbon that was already put, and materials that was already used in the construction of that building, and it's always good to save it. And then the rest of these, the red and the orange show their streets, and then these are the pedestrian walkways that they're putting in, and then they're connecting to a lot of trails, all the dotted lines, so making it much less car oriented. So that sort of is their overall design. But to give you again it's not quite as simple as all that. So as I said, they really focused on how do you reuse some of the buildings. So in this case, they had a department store, the Macy's, that they had a lot of 3 stories construction that was easy enough to reuse. They put the local high school needed more sports fields. So they put a soccer field up on the roof, and they suggested that there could be a lot more classroom and high school space for the high school as after school programs on probably some of the top floors, some shops below, and maybe some healthcare in the lower floors. And then, as I said, restoring the water flow was a really important part of this design. And so you can see here diagrams where they're showing how given this sloping site, how are they handling all of that drainage? And then analyzing just how much less hardscape, or how much more less surface parking lots they're now turning into green space that can act as a sponge and absorb that water and is much healthier for the ecology. They looked a lot at connectivity, because again, if you're going to reduce car use, you need to give people more options to be able to use transit, to be able to bike with trails, and to be able to get the slopes much more comfortable, both for walking and for wheelchairs. So a lot of looking at that larger systems of connectivity. And then within their site, again, looking at how to really reconnect to the neighborhood so that more people could get there without having to use a car. Cars and the greenhouse gas emissions that they emit are really, in the US, one of the biggest contributors to climate change. So it's really important to try to both make it more pleasant and more sociable to walk or bike. It's healthier. And then also work to make it so that we reduce climate change. And the students did very detailed, designed the actual different kinds of streets. Some of the streets are, incorporate transit. Some are shared streets where people and cars are really working together. And then again, really paying attention to the slope to make it so that those are easy for people to walk or roll on. And then there's a lot of, starting to really, they did quite a lot of analysis of, in addition to those slopes, but the heights of the buildings and how to get the greatest heights and densities framing their main central park so that the buildings are making that park feel like an outdoor room and giving it a sense of enclosure. Then there are some parking garages, and those are always in the middle of the blocks. And this one is actually, they turned another one of the department stores that they kept, they turned into a parking garage. And then having a range of different housing sizes. So the department store turned into a parking deck, got wrapped by new housing, and then apartments, but they also have some little tiny cottage courts, small detached homes that are more in keeping with the size of the single family homes that they're adjacent to. And the building types then, again, shown here, really trying to make sure that there's a variety of types of buildings, especially of types of housing, and that they're at different price points and for different size households. In this case, especially focusing on 1 to 2 person households, since that's what we found. There were so many people of that size and type. So lots of, and really analyzing, just trying to, this way we're getting over 400% increase of the percent of the population to get access to the bus stop that is in this, that comes into their design. And then, it's also extremely important to design those public spaces. So again, as I showed, sort of really thinking about the roofs can actually become public spaces, integrating a lot more sports which was seen as really missing from the neighborhood and what the residents were interested in. And then establishing a regulating plan. This is sort of where we handed the project over more to the urban planners, because the urban designers are really doing a lot of design, but we're telling them that those darker purple areas, we want to be zoned for higher density, taller buildings, and then the lower, lighter gray to be the lower density places. So this gives you certainly, some ideas of, I'll go back. This gives you some ideas of the kind of work that urban designers do in school, and then very much the kind of work that they do once they're out working, usually in an office. It might be an office that only does urban design, or it might be an office that also does architecture and or landscape architecture and or civil engineering and or city planning. So it's all overlapping and thinking. So these are pretty big projects that will take years and years to really build and fully build out. What is it that my understanding is that the class, you are charged with doing some placemaking and designing some public spaces in Ukraine, very soon. So as soon as victory comes, that you can already get out and start the reconstruction. So I'm going to now show a bunch of slides that are more focused on how to repair Ukraine bit by bit, and quickly and cheaply, and yet with a lot of cleverness. So one recommendation is that you look online for the Tactical Urbanist's Guide to Materials and Design. And there are a number of books, lots of websites on tactical urbanism, which is short-term action for long-term change. And this was, there's a lot of really terrific ideas and suggestions and strategies that you can find online. Yes. One of the more popular strategies is just called sort of from pavements to plazas. So here's an example in Italy of a big intersection that is completely asphalt and had been completely given to the cars, and pedestrians really had to just cross each individual street at the edge if they wanted to truly cross. So the new design puts the cars entirely on the edges and paints a plaza. It's just paint on top of a plaza and then a few planters and some benches, but really making a space where people can hang out and feel safe. Suddenly now, what was just a big car intersection is a plaza, and it's just paint, some bike racks and some plantings. Sometimes it's similar, such projects working by painting the streets. We can work on making them safer for pedestrians and for bicyclists. So this is an example where folks just went in and painted the crosswalks so that cars really see. I mean, when a car is driving along and suddenly it sees a painted crosswalk, it pays attention. It sends a signal. Hey, there's people here. This is not a space only for you in the car. This is for people. Slow down. And then by also painting the bike lanes, at least at the start of the bike lane, they're really making a space and helping the bikes to be able to cross. They're also doing what is called a bump out on the curb. The cars used to be able to hug this curb and just zoom right along. But instead, Now the cars have to go all the way into the intersection, and they have to slow down to make that turn. And that gives a lot more buffer room to that bicycle lane and to the pedestrians. So again, it's just, there's lots of examples of different designs on these, but it's a great way to promote safety and to also promote ways of, make it people feel safer to use cars and to walk instead of only relying on cars and trucks, which may be in short supply. Tactical urbanism is also great for making gathering places. And again, it's often just a matter of paint. So the upper example is in Riga, Latvia. And I think is a great example of I love how it suddenly created a dialogue across the street by simply making these two little spaces and putting with the bright turquoise, putting some cafe tables out. And the street is still the street. Looks like it has a streetcar in it. But now these become much more inviting and attractive. It's kind of a way of saying, hey, look at me, come hang out. Come linger, let's chat. Similarly, down below, two examples of, in one little courtyard space here, and they painted a rug, painted a carpet on the ground. It's just paint, and then sprinkling in a few seats, a picnic table, some planters. It now becomes a much nicer community space than just the asphalt. Or this one on the right, where they're again using really bright colors to call your attention to turning a vacant lot into a basketball court and a place to play. There's often having spaces where a building may have been demolished and removed. A short-term use before it gets refilled could be great to just use paint to make it a place for people to come and use, to gather in one way or another. Sometimes it's not just about painting the space, it's really to promote that gathering. Sometimes it's about planning an event. In Paris, what the République neighborhood, Republic, a group organized what was initially just one night where everyone was invited to dinner. They simply set up all this, connected all these tables, created a very, very long dinner table and chairs, invited people, bring food to share. And the only goal was to just get the community to help to learn to know each other. Say bonjour. It's evolved. It was so popular. They're now doing it more and more. More neighbors have gotten to know each other. They're also putting in edible landscaping. So there's gardens that anyone is welcome to pick vegetables from. And it's really built up much more social concern for people. So during the pandemic, neighbors and children were making masks to pass out, to give to others. It's a really terrific example of helping the community, as they say in this article here, and make it an urban neighborhood that is that much more focused on environment, healthcare, public space, and mobility. Lots of really great examples out there. Now that one, again, that was a big organized one. Sometimes it can just be simple little things. This happens to be 2 blocks from my home in Atlanta, Georgia, where a vacant lot was turned into a dog park, but it also, they did something most dog parks haven't thought of. They also brought in a little trailer that is now the bar. They sell alcohol there. And then they have another little trailer that is the coffee bar. So it's a place for people and their dogs to just hang out. They do yoga in the morning, fetch and stretch. It has become extremely popular. And I'm not a dog person, but I love watching the dogs run and jump and play around. It's a great way to, again, just sort of use a vacant space and actually fill it with joy, which people need very much. But sometimes, parks, parks are just so important. So even a dog park is one thing. That one happened to have been with artificial grass because the dogs tear it up, but it could be gravel, it could be any dirt. But the importance of gardens, the importance of parks as places to heal is also really very, very important. So I'm going to show a little more detail. These two parks, they're both very different and both exactly what communities need. So this is in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And this particular area is just the other side of a railroad track from the downtown. This was a more industrial area. It was also in the 1920s, this street at the edge was bustling with life. It was considered the Black American Wall Street. This was a thriving African-American neighborhood that sadly was completely demolished during a massacre that occurred where white people were very angry at a lie that had been told about a Black man assaulting someone. It turned out not to be true, but that led to just fires and demolition of the neighborhood. And then it built back, and then it was demolished again when this highway was built. So this park is about commemorating the violence that occurred, but it's a park of reconciliation. It has a lot of statues. It's a very somber park. It's a place to go and reflect. It's a memorial park, a place to be quiet. It's fenced off. There's only limited entrance, good places, lots of school buses come in, but this one is a quiet place, but is absolutely needed as a place to reflect on the violence, but also for reconciliation and for efforts to try to rebuild and move forward especially on race relations. Now, this other park, just 2 blocks away, Guthrie Green, I'll show this one in more detail here. So this park used to be basically a parking lot. It was a truck dock. So trucks were built, would come and fill up and then go make deliveries. It's been turned into a very actively programmed park. It's not very big. It's just 1 block. It has a stage at one end and gently sloping, so for audience. So they have musical performances, bands, movie nights, all sorts of activities for children, races and games, and the whole thing is powered by geothermal power that goes dug down as they were depaving. They put in geothermal wells that provide heating and power. And that helps to make the project much more sustainable and keep the costs down. So this one is a park to have fun, to be active, to be healthy. It's won awards for actually all the children's health activities that they do there. It gets lined up with food trucks once a week. They have lots and lots of activities. And it's really helped revitalize what is now a thriving, largely arts community around this area of old warehouses, and now getting some museums and lots of artists. While the Reconciliation Park though I would argue is still just as important. We need both of these kinds of parks. But sometimes you don't have the time to necessarily build a park. I would hope that Ukraine will have a lot more parks, because some of the sites, it won't make sense to rebuild on every site. And sometimes we really need parks. But for immediate short-term things, one way to add greenery to spaces is through moss graffiti. I love moss graffiti. I just think it's so beautiful, and it's such a great, wonderful way. And you can find out online how to do it. Apparently, it's very easy. But you can make messages. And we do know that our brains are wired to heal when we see nature. And so positive messages and being spelled out in moss actually can have what's called a biophilia response in our brains and make us feel better. Also, obviously, there's still a lot we can do with gardens. And I think lots of the public space revitalization that would benefit from both healing gardens and vegetable gardens. And I show some examples of both of those right here. And then sometimes one can get creative with pop-up shops and services. And I'm going to show a whole bunch of, some of these examples are sort of silly, but they're more like one-time events. But here, a bus is now turned into a vaccination site. So they can move from parking lot to parking lot, but it transforms that parking lot for the day into a place of healthcare. Here's an example from Texas where a street where every shop had been closed, not a single one was open. And there wasn't because of war or anything. It was just this town had sort of fallen asleep. Everybody was shopping at the mall instead of in the town. So a group of very young adults said, all right, they got a permit for a 2-day art installation, and they painted bike lanes, they brought in plastic street lamps, they put in planters, and they opened up every shop and just had sort of temporary exhibits in them, and they brought in a big band. Everybody loved it. And they told the mayor, they said, Mr. Mayor, it was a big party. And Mr. Mayor, if you want this to be permanent, just make 2 changes. Change your zoning code to allow cafe seating and don't require parking for shops smaller than that size, 2,500 feet. That the street is still alive today, several years later. This totally woke up the street, and they did make those changes. Other pop-up sort of services, Ukraine is going to have a lot of scaffolding up as buildings are being restored. This particular group, Softwalks, has designed portable seats and counters that can attach to the scaffolding and then turn the sidewalks into fun, more people-oriented places and allow for some nicer use. I love this example of a pop-up sidewalk cinema. What this example is, someone said, okay, look, these outdoor stairs, we'll turn them into seating, and then we can show movies. So sometimes little small intimate things can become great ways of just helping to build a community, give people a little bit of a break, and revitalize your public realm. I'm going to pass on this one, but because I'm running out of time here. But I mean, there's also a lot of opportunity to recycle building materials. And I think, again, especially when you're when there's been a lot of demolished buildings and around. So here's a wonderful example, I think, of a house that has been built largely using recycling shutters. What in your community, what kind of distinctive materials, distinctive building components could you recycle and could be used for pavilions or new buildings. I'm going to also, here's a building that is made out of the different wavy colors there are there. It's all concrete, but it's different colors of concrete because they recycled aggregate from buildings that had been demolished. The aggregate are all the little stones and pebbles in the concrete. So by the demolished buildings, as they get crushed up, they have a different color palette. So here it's reusing it to now make a building that is very oriented to children and children's needs. I think a really great example. And then my last example, this one is a chapel that is built in a very rural area of Alabama, and it's built primarily out of recycled car windows and car windshields to create the roof and facade. I love that this example, again, of just really being imaginative about what you can reuse. So last slide, how do you, I've shown you what an urban, a sort of more typical urban design project that my students had worked on. I showed you immediate change, kinds of quick things you could do, but I want to leave you with also thinking about the longer term future. Certainly climate change. Ukraine is expected to see more severe storms, riverine flooding, droughts, and heat waves. So you need to be thinking, how do you build back in a way that is better prepared than the old way to deal with climate change? Public health is going to continue to be a very serious issue. There will be a great many veterans of the war, injured civilians with both physical and mental health difficulties in the population. So you're going to, your designs and rethinking how does Ukraine deal with sort of the access for the disabled and with healing spaces for those suffering trauma. And then third, I especially hope that this group will really think about gender equity. Women worldwide, and it's certainly true in Ukraine, continue to do most of the unpaid care work, and they would really benefit from collective kitchens, more daycare, more senior care, and care for and spaces that will help to care for the disabled, so that women are not having to try to work the double shift of paid work and unpaid work. So with that, I'm done, and I'd love to take some questions. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Ellen, thank you so much for your presentation and such interesting lecture. I guess, the next, like, people can ask question. Та, любі друзі, можете задавати питання, якщо хочете, можете вмикати мікрофончик усно, якщо ні, I see that we have some question in the chat. I think that I will read it. One moment. The first question from Irina: is the cost and speed of construction also the same?
So speed of, I'm not sure. I need a little more specifics. I'm not sure that I can answer that.
Окей. Ірин, чи можете більш якось розгорнутіше задати питання, або можете українською сказати? Окей.
Hi, yes.
Okay.
The question was about the first slide that you had when you were comparing the Soviet bloc with the block of buildings in Stockholm, and you said that, look, they have different things in mind. So my question is, while they were constructing those blocks, was the construction and speed, the cost of construction and speed of construction in Stockholm the same as for cheap, affordable housing after the war in the Soviet Union?
I don't know the exact specifics for either of those examples, but certainly initially, a lot of that Soviet housing was built only to be temporary because they knew they were cutting costs a little, and in some places maybe a little too much, but they're still surviving. They're still housing people. Not everybody's, it's not the same standard that one would see in new construction typically today. But we've made a lot of progress in new ways of building quickly and building well. But there's always something of a trade-off between building quickly and building well. And in the long term, it's better to build well, but there's always going to be something of a trade-off there. I hope that helps. Yeah, I can see the questions, but I know you've got some hands up. How do you want to do this?
We can change it one by one. So I think that we can ask Natalie. You can unmute yourself and ask the questions that you have.
Yeah, I'm kind of about the topic of the park was reconciliation and memorials. Currently, there's like one project from STEM is FEM, and we are working on a park which is supposed to be memorial or reconciliation park. However, the question is about memorial is sort of like one function park, but we are thinking about including few functions inside of it. So maybe you have any suggestions like what should be included so the park will not only be just a memorial, but as well like about more probably.
I think it's always really interesting. I'd say a couple that I would recommend looking at. There's another project I did not show, but by Mass Design in Montgomery, Alabama. I think it's called the Memorial to Peace and Justice, but it's informally referred to, and you can probably also find on Google, as the Memorial to Lynching. It is a memorial to one of the most horrific acts, the lynching of Black people mostly in the 1920s, where they were hung and just no justice. But the design of that museum makes an experience that as a visitor, you are constantly going down, and the memorials are getting higher and higher. They are getting hung above your head. So you experience essentially a little bit what a visitor at a lynching experience. It really makes it powerful. So I think thinking about not just the activities, but what are the kinds of experience? Do you want someone visiting your memorial to feel sort of elevated and dreaming and looking to the heavens? Or do you want them to actually feel horrible, feel bad, and feel sucked into, the earth, or sucked down in a way that they can't, and then you let them feel more released. So I think about the experience as well as the activities. I think there's often just having spaces for events that you don't necessarily control now, but you at least have an amphitheater. You have spaces where people in the future will put on their own events that you don't even know what they are, is always a good strategy.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah, great. So the next question is in the chat. Ellen, how it would be better to read? You can read it by yourself, or I can read it out loud.
Well, I can see what books or articles on urban design would you recommend to read first to young designers and to those who will be involved into rebuilding Ukraine? And that is a great question. I'm going to think about that one more and I'll send an answer to that later, because it's there's a lot out there.
Yeah, but it would be great. I just also would like to ask.
The one book, if you only read one book, it's a long book, but she's a really good writer, is Jane Jacobs, who wrote a book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, in 1961. And she was ridiculed for being an untrained woman. And that is still the #1 best-selling book on urban planning anywhere. And it's an amazing book of her critique of modernist planning and her admiration for how good neighborhoods work. And there's a lot of really great lessons in that book still.
Yeah, and I also know that this book is also in Ukrainian. We have it. Ця книжка також є українською мовою, тому буде можливість прочитати. Okay, great. So the next one is Охрименко. Sorry, I cannot, I don't know your name, but you can unmute and ask your question.
Я скажу українською. В першу чергу ви багато казали на рахунок того,
Sorry, one moment. Ellen, can you switch, try to switch it to English so you can hear the translation of the question? Yeah, great. Yeah, будь ласка, та продовжуйте.
Yes, I hear the interpreter now. Yes.
Great.
Чудово.
But I didn't hear all of the question. I only heard a little bit of it.
Я зараз продовжу. Ви багато казали саме про відновлення України. В нас дуже багато зруйнованих місць. Це можуть бути і маленькі місця в великих містах, і це можуть бути прям цілі регіони. Як поєднати так, щоб відновлювати не тільки те, що було вже зруйноване, а й підтягувати те, що вже є, до цього єдиного стандарту, бо навіть та фотографія, яку ви вже показали на першому слайді, це була забудова, яка просто жахливо дратує очі. І як зробити це гармонійно, щоб ми могли і відновити те, що вже було зруйноване, і те, що не зруйноване, але також підлягає новим сенсам.
So I absolutely agree. And I think I was trying to convey the message that I think this is, nobody wanted it to turn out this way, but it is an opportunity to upgrade and update the towns and cities. And I think, but also rather, I think it is up to each community to really, and to figure out where that balance sits. For a lot of people, especially after war, or even natural disasters, the trauma is so great that a lot of people, for their mental health, need to see the old restored, at least to some degree, just rebuild it back exactly as it was. That is what happens a lot, and it helps people, but we can build better. And I think it's more, we can, there's a lot. This is where it's important. We need more women going into studying urban planning, studying architecture, studying landscape architecture, civil engineering, to be able to help shift the mindsets from just doing the same old thing. But I think it's pay attention to public health, pay attention to climate change, and learn what the latest and newest, better ways to do things are. But at the same time, I mean, the reason I asked you to think about your favorite part of your favorite street in your hometown was to also help you recognize there are things of value in your old town that you want to preserve and you want to build on. So I would hope that, I think it's rare that you ever want to just demolish everything and start new. And I would just always try to make it less car oriented. That is just my number one. Modern, everything we do, sort of at this point, everything that I'm working on, and most of the urban designers I know, is to try to reduce dependence on the car, and at least let people be able to not have to use the car so much.
Okay, great. So we can go for the next question. Is it possible to provide the same quantity of flats as in Soviet design while building the kind of district as in Stockholm?
Surprisingly, yes. I mean, it all depends. I don't know. I have not compared the exact numbers on those two examples, but the low-rise density, what tends to happen with those tall buildings. So the Soviet examples, the buildings were set pretty far apart from each other, and that had a good purpose. They got sunlight into every room. into every flat certainly got some sunlight. But when you build lower, but have everything closer together, and then you still have lots of little courtyards and things. That's how you can absolutely often get even higher density, and yet it's more social. The space is actually getting used more. And that's not to say there isn't room for having some high rises, and in certain places, absolutely, it makes sense, especially if you have a lot of transit access. But people do it when you just look at the building, you might say, oh, that houses more people, but you have to look at the size of the building plus its outdoor space. And you might be able to, often you can end up going somewhere in the middle, rise. There's lots and lots. Yes, you can get the same density and the same number of units. But you also get more variety of units that help to fit different kinds of households. And that's important too.
Yes, thanks a lot for the answering. Like the next question is there any possibilities or possible way to integrate the needs of drivers, cyclists, and pedestrians simultaneously into urban design?
Absolutely. So it's called Complete Streets, is a movement. Lots of examples of how to combine the needs of all three. Absolutely. And the other interesting term for it that you can look up is road diet. You put the road on a diet, and you can simply by narrowing the lanes for the cars, so they have to slow down a little bit, but that gives you more, that gives you the space you need to be able to put in the bike lane or the dedicated transit lane.
Okay, so the next one from Georgie. You talk about paint like solution to make streets look better. We would have two problems called climate and rains, hard tender systems that government can't renovate paint regularly. Could you advise another material which will live too longer?
Honestly, I mean, in many ways, I was in Berlin last summer, and the bike lanes always had the smoothest pavement. It wasn't just paint, but it was a very smooth stone often. And then the sidewalk was concrete, and then the road was asphalt, or maybe cobblestones. But it was just by using different textures, it easily communicated to who was going to be on the bike, where would you walk, and where would you drive. So yes, it can be done, and now often it's much more attractive to do it that way. But so a lot of times the paint, it still lasts a while. I mean, when you think of stripe paint on a road, that paint lasts pretty long. So the striping still has, sometimes you want to call attention. You need that bright color for the cars to notice, especially when you're first introducing bicycles to a street that drivers have not been used to seeing bicycles or pedestrians on. You often want that bright color. Okay,
so the next one is, I will try to translate it in English. Whether you can advise how in Ukraine we can create a barrier-free and inclusive space during the reconstruction process in our country.
Reconstruction is going to be awkward. There's no other way to sort of put it. There will be some streets will get closed because they're going to have too many trucks and things in there. There will be a lot of the spaces will be very different. And really that's sort of why I deliberately showed creating spaces for people to release their tension. I mean, one of the things, circuses become extremely important often as cities are healing from trauma. Movies, cinema, play. So yes, people are going to be frustrated during reconstruction. And honestly, you can't really do much about that. It's going to be frustrating. But what you can do is give people a place to have some fun and to sort of relax and like, okay, it's getting better. It'll get better. We're on the path. So.
Okay, and I guess the last question, I guess, do you have an experience of work between government and business in public place renovation? What government should offer to get money from the business to make their life better?
You know, it's interesting. I don't know how things operate in Ukraine, but in the US, there is almost all redevelopment is what's called a public-private partnership. So brand new development, if a developer is just going out to farmland and building, sometimes they get some public assistance. The goal in the US generally is that the expectation is you want the public sector should own the streets, the sewers, the electrical wires, that public infrastructure. We want the infrastructure to be publicly owned and managed. And so in redevelopment, typically the government may give a tax break to the developer and say, okay, you can yourself keep some of the taxes raised on your site to pay for the infrastructure over time. Or sometimes the government itself will pay for the infrastructure work, and they'll take out a bond because they can take out long-term, very low interest rates to pay that back. And then the government will pay back that cost with the improved property taxes. So there's a lot of different ways that people negotiate these public-private partnerships. But that is absolutely how most redevelopment, it's always a negotiation.
Okay, thanks a lot. And I guess the last question, is it okay to answer, Ellen? Yeah?
Yeah.
Great. I will try also to translate it correctly. Whether it is possible to make people love and start appreciate cycling and walking instead of using cars in the city, while with the instruments that can use in urban design? If yes, how?
So there's a lot of research actually on this. And in the US, we've seen an enormous increase in biking, especially now with electric bikes, e-bikes. And it's mostly older people who especially are the number one purchasers of e-bikes. A lot of the biking, I'm a cyclist. I got rid of my car 8 years ago now, and bike most everywhere. But there are people who will only bike if they feel really safe. There are people who will bike anyway. They don't care. And then there are the people who it really has to be very safe. So the design of the bike lanes and whether they're protected makes a big difference in how much people will feel comfortable riding or not. In Atlanta, we found that actually we converted some of our unused railroads into a trail, a 22-mile loop of a trail, and it has become so popular. That's now, people love walking, biking, using scooters on the Beltline, that now that got a lot of people, because there's no cars, that sort of was the one place they could sort of remind themselves how to bike and sort of learn it again and learn to love it. So we now have neighborhoods that are bike-oriented development along the Beltline. So one gets, not everyone can bike, not everyone will bike by any stretch, but if you make biking, for me, it's fast. If I take my bike on this Beltline trail to the grocery store, I've got the bags fit into my baskets perfectly. I can get groceries way faster that way than driving, and actually all the traffic. And, so when biking becomes more convenient, or transit becomes more convenient, or walking becomes more convenient than the car, that's when people start to switch. And it is genuinely so much healthier.
Great, thanks a lot. Like, okay, guys, I would like to ask you not to write any more questions because we're out of the time. But the last question for sure, in historical center, we have a lot of areas with paving stones and the road materials. Is there any way to create bike lines on a road like that?
That is a tough one. You'd want to either remove the stones and put them into some other street that doesn't have those old stones. Because biking on paving stones is, if they're generally not a good idea. So you do generally want a smoother surface, or it might mean that the biking needs to go on parallel streets, sometimes not on that particular street, or you find trails in other places. But
okay, yeah. So it was the last question. Thank you very much, Ellen, for your participation. Like, we are very honored that you were a lecturer in our in our courses. So I think that everyone enjoyed your lecture. It was really interesting, and it's like you showed that the community in Ukraine also can do for the better to rebuild Ukraine also. Yeah, so thank you so much. I just remind our audience that we have social medias, and if you want to follow us and to get know about new events, so please follow us, and yeah, we will be very great. We will be very happy to see you again. So yeah, Ellen, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's really my honor, and I can't wait to see Ukraine being rebuilt and see all of you being great urban designers.
Yeah, we are waiting for you in Ukraine when we have yes, peace. Yeah. So thank you so much. Yeah, bye. Have a nice day. Have a nice evening, guys. Yeah, bye.